So we began our discussion of the relationship between Koshel Beracha and the Daled Kosos on the night of Pesach. So I'd like to continue that discussion. So what I'd like to do for the next, let's say, 10 minutes is summarize, give a highlight or an overview of that which we discussed last week with regard to the definition of Koshel Beracha and Shtia from a Koshel Beracha and the Daled Kosos. So we're looking into Amudei Hod for Masechta Psachim, Siman Aleph, and we had a number of problems and objections to the analysis of the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav invoked three proofs to indicate that there's a fundamental machlokes with regard to the nature of Daled Kosos, and that there is a school of thought that is maintained by both Kosos and the Rush to the effect that Daled Kosos are really just simply Daled Kosos Shel Beracha. You can reduce Daled Kosos of Leil Pesach to 4 Kosos of Beracha, which means that we have the 4 brachos, starting with Kiddush, Gal Yisrael, Birkas Hamazon, and completing with Hallel. Each one of those brachos requires a kos. And that's typical of a koshel bracha, which is a kos that's taken to, shall we say, embellish a bracha, which is a birchas hodah, a birchas shevach. So we have on the night of Pesach 4 of them. We calculate 1, 2, 3, 4. We end up with 4 kos shel bracha. And the Brisker Rav's first proof is from the fact that Tosos says, based on a diuk in the Mishnah at the beginning of our Psachim, that we need not supply the entire family, the entire household with Daled Kosos. It's sufficient that we supply the Balabayas with Daled Kosos, and he'll be motzi all the others, and they'll fulfill their mitzvah. And this will apply to each one of the 4 kosos by listening to the Balabayas. He'll drink from the kos, and that's how they'll fulfill their mitzvah. And Tosos says, "My shnami kiddush b'chol hashana." Tosos has the analogy to kiddush, in which case, in the mitzvah of kiddush, we have the makadesh. No one has to drink from the kos. And if one person drinks from the kos, that's sufficient. And Tosos therefore justifies his diuk in a meticulous reading of the Mishnah, the word lo in Lashon Yachid, that it's enough to supply one person, namely the Balabayas, the Oni, with Daled Kosos. That was proof number 1. And the Brisker Rav invokes proof number 2 from a Tosos later on, who asks Akasha, why not allow the Daled Kosos over what's called chai, which is concentrated wine, just like with regard to a koshel bracha. The Gemara tells us in Masechta Brachos on Daf Nun Beis that there are 10 laws that apply to a koshel bracha, one of which is yain chai, undiluted wine. That analogy, that equation, which underlies the Tosos, is predicated on Tosos Lishitaso, that in his view, the Daled Kosos of Leil Pesach, like a koshel bracha, require nothing more than chai, not mazug, but rather chai. And insofar as Daled Kosos, according to the Shitas HaTosos, are Daled Kosos Shel Beracha, nothing beyond that, therefore the halacha is chai. And the third proof is from the halacha of Mole Lugma, which means that even though the Ramban and the Ran are both of the opinion that Mole Lugma is not sufficient with regard to Dalit Kosos, even though Mole Lugma is sufficient. How do I do this?
Done. You got to mute.
Oh, okay, good. So with regard to Dalit Kosos, Mole Lugmav as a minimum volume of Mida of Shtia is sufficient. Says the Ramban, and later on the Ran, that with regard to Dalit Kosos, Mole Lugmav is not sufficient because there's a halacha requirement in Dalit Kosos that goes way beyond the mitzvah of Koshel Bracha, so that in Kiddush, as one amongst many examples of a Koshel Bracha, Mole Lugmav is enough, but on the night of the Seder, for the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos, we need Shtias Rov Kos. Kosos, on the other hand, disagrees with the Ramban and the Ran, and he's of the opinion on Daf Kuf Ches Amid Beis that when the Gemara talks about Rov Kos or any indication that you have to drink Rov Kos on Leil Pesach, it doesn't mean Rov of whatever size kos you have. You have a large kos, you have to drink most of that kos, but rather it means Mole Lugma. So Tosis borrows Mole Lugma from Kos Shel Bracha and applies it to Dalid Kosos on Leil Pesach. And all this, says the Brisker Rav, is the consistency of Tosfos maintaining that there's no special mitzvah of Dalid Kosos as a requirement of Shtia on Leil Pesach, but rather it's another example of Koshel Bracha, that just at this time we multiply Koshel Bracha by 4. You have 4 different brachos, each of which requires a kos. But the laws that regulate those kosos and the kiyuv mitzvah that has to be achieved with regard to Dalit Kosos is no different than the Koshel Bracha of Kiddush, of Avdollah, of Koshel Eris and Koshel Nesuin, etc., etc. And therefore, Mole Lugmav is sufficient. Against the Ramban, who requires Rov Kos, depending upon what size your kosa is, might be a lot more, a greater volume than Mole Lugmav. So the Amudei Hod, again, just to summarize the highlights of his objection against the Brisker Rav, he asks the following question. Well, number one, Tosos comes to the final conclusion that Roy Shiyeh Kos Lefnei Kol Echad V'Echad Mibnei Abayis. In other words, we have to be machmir with regard to Dalit Kosos and require that each person is supplied with Dalit Kosos. And we saw this in the end of that Tosfos last week. We saw it inside. The Rush as well writes that every single person should have his own kos. And according to the Brisker Rav, we wonder why that's so. If according to the Brisker Rav, in the sheet of Kosos and the Rush, all you need is Mole Lugmav, and that we borrow by analogy from Koshel Bracha, then why do you have to supply each one of the Bnei Abayis with his own set of Dalit Kosos? Then as far as Meziga is concerned, as opposed to Yayin Chai, and Tosfos quotes the Sugya in Koshel Bracha, in Brachas Mudbeis, that for a Koshel Bracha, we take Yayin Chai, he says the following. According to the Brisker Rav, since Tosfos L'Maskana requires that every one of the Bnei Abayis be supplied with his own Dalit Kosos, which means that each person requires his own shtia from Dalit Kosos, then you see that Tosfos in Dalit Kosos is going beyond the Koshel Bracha. In Koshel Bracha, for example, Kiddush, we don't require that everyone has his own kos. And yet Tosfos in Dalit Kosos requires that. So why does Tosfos therefore think that Dalit Kosos on Leil Pesach suffice with Yayin Chai? Why does Tosfos draw that conclusion? According to the Brisker Rav's logic, since Tosfos L'Maskana requires that every person be supplied with his own Dalit Kosos, that means clearly that Dalit Kosos stands in contrast and is fundamentally different than a Koshel Bracha. Hence, Tosfos really has no basis for his objection. His kasha for the Gemara Brachos requiring Yayid Chai could be that with regard to Dalit Kosos, where each person is required to have his own set of Dalit Kosos, he should drink Yayin Mazik that's already been diluted. Furthermore, how is the Brisker Rav going to explain the rush in Tshuva, which is going to be the subject of our Shia today, but just what we touched on last week, as far as the rush in a Tshuva, the rush writes, Yesh chiyuv b'fnei atzmo lishtos dalid kosos. So the rush clearly in Tshuva is going beyond a koshel bracha by requiring a separate, independent obligation to drink the Dalit Kosos. Although the rush is going to identify Rov Kos as Mole Lugmav, as opposed to the Ramban, who says it all depends on the size of your kos. But nevertheless, according to the Brisker Rav, the halacha of Mole Lugmav is halacha in a koshel bracha, where there's no requirement of shtia as an independent requirement. It's just Mole Lugmav as te'ima to connect the bracha with the kos. But in Dalit Kosos, the Rush says that we need shtia of Dalit Kosos. And the Rush says that you require Rov Kos, which he identifies with Mole Lugmav, but he comes to that conclusion based on the requirement of Rov Kos, and proves that therefore you need shtia. Whenever you see Rov Kos, it may be in volume equal to Mole Lugmav, but conceptually, Rov Kos means shtiatz Rov Kos. And the Rush therefore concludes that this halacha of shtias Dalit Kosos as a separate requirement, in contrast to koshel bracha, which has no separate requirement of shtias hakos. Te'ima, yes, but shtia not. So the Rush clearly, explicitly in the Tshuva indicates that Dalit Kosos requires shtia as an independent obligation. And yet, the shtia of Dalit Kosos, says the Rush, it's sufficient if you drink Mole Lugma, which Tosfos identifies not as shtia, but as te'ima. So how do we understand the Rush according to the Brisker Rav's logic? The Rush is actually involved in a contradiction, because the Brisker Rav understands that Mole Lugmav is a halach of te'ima in koshel bracha, where there's no independent chiyuv of shtia. The Rush understood that Rov Kos equals Mole Lugmav, and that's the amount of wine that you're required to drink as a separate, independent kiyum of the obligation of shtias Dalit Kosos. So according to Brisker Rav, you're crossing over lines over here. there's a crisscross of lines because Kosos says that Moli Lugmov is identified with Te'ima, where there's no separate mitzvah of Shtia, and yet the Rosh insists that Dalet Kosos has a separate Chiyuv and Kiyuv of Shtia, and yet Moli Lugmov is enough. How do you make sense out of that? So the last thing we discussed, which if you happen to have the Amudei Hod, is on page Daled, is a breakthrough definition, a concept of the Ritva. The Ritva comes up with something brand new. And the principle of the Ritva is called Chad Gufa. What does that mean, Chad Gufa? So this is the embellishment of the Ritva by the Chazon Ish. And the Ritva assumes that with regard to a Koshel Beracha, we need Shtia. However, one Shtia somehow is sufficient for all those who hear Kiddush or any Koshel Beracha. Whenever I mention Kiddush, by the way, I don't have to go through this every time. You'll understand that Kiddush is the paradigm in case of the Koshel Beracha. But the Ritva says that all those who are participating in that Kiddush, anyone who's sitting around and is dipping in, so to speak, to the Kiddush of the Mekadesh, his Shtia is related to every one of the people at the table. So it's as if each one at the table had a Shtia. This is the Ritva, which, embellished by the Chazon Ish, means that not only do we relate the bracha itself to all the people who are listening, which is called Shomea Ka'ona. Ka'ona means it's as if each one recited his own Kiddush. But moreover, even with regard to the Shtia of one person relates to the entire group of people. So just like in the Amiras HaBracha, we have Allah of Shomei Kod. It doesn't matter who makes the bracha, but whoever makes the bracha, it's considered Chad Gufa, says the Chazon Ish, as if everyone is part of the same body and he's an owner. It's as he recited Kiddush. That's not only as far as the bracha, but the Ritva is extending the halach of Chad Gufa to apply even to the Shtia. And whoever drinks from the Kos, insofar as they all share the one single mitzvah of the bracha, it's as if he drank from it's as if each one of them, every person, Chad Gufa, drank from the Kos. So in effect, what we're saying is that not only is the bracha chal for each person, but even the Shtia is chal for each person. And that's a principle called Chad Gufa. So that's what we mentioned last week. And on page Daled, he says the following. Smirle la Ritva, this on the right column, the first, well, there's only one major paragraph that takes up 2/3 of the right column on page Daled. The Ritva holds the Kol Misha Mekadesh. We need a Te'ima that links up to his Kiddush. So we have like an entity here that's made up of two parts. The recitation of the Beracha of Kiddush, again, Kiddush being paradigmic of many, many other Kosos. And not only is he reciting the Beracha, but he's drinking from the Kos. But the Ritva says, just like it doesn't matter who recites the Kiddush, everyone is considered as if he recited the Kiddush. Is Mahani Te'imas Acherim, no matter who will be the one who tastes from the Kos. And it doesn't have to be the Makadesh, it could be anyone who's sitting at the table. It's because that since there's a din of Shomer Ka'oneh, which means that they become a guf echad as far as the Amiras HaBrach is concerned, so that when you recite Kiddush and I'm listening to your Kiddush, Shomer Ka'oneh tells me as if I recited my Kiddush, so too, Nasu Kechad Gufa Le'inyan Te'ima. And it doesn't matter who amongst the people at the table will actually drink from the Kos, that Te'ima relates to everyone. Through the principle of Chad Gufa. It's therefore Sarei Ta'amu Kula. In effect, it's like all of them recited the Bracha and all of them did the Te'ima. So what it means is the following. Let's give it names. Let's say Reuven is the Makadesh. Shimon is listening to Reuven's Kiddush. Shimon does the Te'ima. And Reuven starts talking about the football game in Manchester. And he hasn't drunk from the Kos. The Ritva argues that he was Yotzei the mitzvah of Kiddush because the Te'ima was achieved and implemented not by Reuven himself, but by Shimon. And Shimon's Te'ima relates to Reuven as if Reuven had implemented the Te'ima. So even though Reuven starts talking about the football game, which is called Sicha, which is a hefsek, and he hasn't yet drunk from the Kos Shel Kiddush, it matters not. The Ritva says he's Yotzei. Because the Shomer Ka'oneh linkage that creates a Chad Guf as if each one recited the Bracha extends to include the Te'ima as well, as if each person at the table was Toeh. But what the Amudei Hod is going to point out here is that only applies because, or shall we say, with regard to Kos Shel Bracha. They're all one Chad Gufa within the framework of the Kiyum of Kos Shel Bracha. So Chad Gufa operates according to Ritva in Kos Shel Bracha. But what happens, this is the Amudei Hod, if we add another Kiyum HaMitzvah, which is not an obligation of recitation of a bracha over a kos, that extra additional Kiyum, if you piggyback another mitzvah on top of the mitzvah of Kos Shel Bracha, that's going to force you to undermine and cancel the halach of Chad Gufa with regard to that extra kiyum. Meaning, if you have an overlap of another mitzvah that is cloned, I don't know what word to use, on top of the mitzvah of kosher bracha, then with regard to that extra mitzvah that you've added, you have a piggyback, that extra mitzvah on top of the piggyback is not included under the Chad Gufa principle. And this is the key to unlock the mystery of the Rosh. The Rosh in Tshuva argues that in addition to the mitzvah of Daled Kosos, there's a mitzvah of I'm sorry, what did I just say? In addition to the mitzvah of Daled Kosos Shel Beracha, meaning Kosel Bracha 1, 2, 3, and 4 times 4, in addition to that, there's a mitzvah on the Leil HaSeder of Daled Kosos. And what does that Daled Kosos do? What does it achieve? It removes the halacha of Chad Gufa. Let's see it inside. You'll see it on page Dalet again. Can you show me by a show of hands, if you don't mind? I know it sounds like Zoom is very hard for me, so it's a little bit childish, but just by show of hands, do you have the Amudei Hod? Only, yes? Okay, great. That calms me down a little bit. So we're on page Dalet, and we're in the middle of the main paragraph, which is called Yud Aleph. The first word in the line is Hashtia, and he says, So I'm hoping you have it inside. Once again, we're in Siman Aleph, Seif Yud Aleph, on the left column of page Dalet. In the middle of that column of Yud Aleph, the first word in the line is Hashtia, and then it says So what we're saying now is the following. That fundamentally, according to the Rosh, essentially, Daled Kosos means Daled Kosos Shel Beracha. But the addition of the kiyum of Daled Kosos of Leil Pesach, meaning the 4 Kosos, integrate to form a new entity. It's not just 1, 2, 3, 4 as 4 separate Kosos Shel Beracha, but rather, in addition to each Kos Shel Beracha as a separate entity, as an independent entity, there's a new entity called Daled Kosos with a new Kiyum HaMitzvah. You'll get extra brownie points here. In addition to fulfilling Kos Shel Beracha times 4, you have a Kiyum of Daled Kosos. And the nafkamina is going to only be as far as Chad Guf is concerned. The basic structure and laws that govern Kosos Shel Beracha will apply to Daled Kosos as well. But one thing we can't apply, and that is the Chad Gufa of Shtia. Meaning that one person from the whole group hearing Kiddush could do the Shtia of Te'ima of Molei Lugmav on behalf of everyone else, as if everyone else drank from the cups. That we can't say on Leil HaPesach. Why? Ach b'Leil HaSeder, shemulvad zeh, shemekayim din Kiddush v'gol Yisrael, Berachas HaMozon v'halol shel alakol. Milvad zeh, meaning above and beyond the fulfillment of 4 brachos, each one over a kos. Tiknu, the Rabbanan instituted, Shegabi osan amiros tiskayim gam mitzvah nosefes. The 4 amiros of 4 brachos are integrated to form an entity. We'll call it, for our purposes, he doesn't spell it out, but at least this helps me. We'll call it Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. Again, you can ask me the obvious question: what is What does Kiddush have to do with Tzibur Yitzis Mitzrayim? What does Birkas HaMazon have to do with Tzibur Yitzis Mitzrayim? We'll get to that. Be calm about that. I promise you an answer to that question. Both Kiddush and Birkas HaMazon mention Yitzias Mitzrayim. So they're all integrated into one matrix, into one constellation, which is called Tzibur Yitzias Mitzrayim. That's Berzon's footnote or expansion on the Amudei Hod. I hope I'm right. So what is the takana? The Rabbanan, in a sense, descended upon a pre-existing mitzvah to add a new mitzvah. The pre-existing mitzvah was that each kos, insofar as it's a koshel bracha, has the kiyum mitzvah of koshel bracha. The Rabbanan jumped on the bandwagon here, and they added another level here, another dimension of a kiyum of daled kosos, which we called sipur, on the night of Pesach. And therefore, gam bi osam ha'miros, this kayim gam mitzvah no sefes. Vehi mitzvahs daled kosos. Now, how, if the Rabbanan are taking a pre-existing mitzvah and adding another mitzvah to it, there's a tremendous paradox here. Every mitzvah, by definition, requires some sort of an action. So what upgrades this action of a koshel bracha to a kiyum of daled kosos, to this mitzvah nosefes shetiknu? You follow me? You can't say that one action serves two purposes, two goals, and two kiyumim if one of those two actions is already a long established old mitzvah from Kadmis Dinan, from the time of Sheshis Mei Breishis. You know, you can't add another mitzvah to a mitzvah. There's not enough space. The space is already taken up by mitzvah A. In this case, koshel bracha. So you have now koshel bracha. Now you want to call it another mitzvah and give me credit for another mitzvah. How can you do so? Did I lift up a finger to add the extra kiyum? Did I change the first kiyum in any subtle way? I didn't lift up a pinky, if you follow my idiomatic phrase. Where is the second kiyum? You want to be masaking another mitzvah on top of a pre-existing one? Show me where the second mitzvah adds something to the first mitzvah. He says, "L'gavi hach mitzvah dedaled kosos amru d'lo yichashev hashomea im hamavarech kechad gufa le'inyan shtia." Excuse me. I want to read that again. I mean, this is the punchline, I think, of the Amudei Hod so far. And this is where we got stuck last week. Amru, when the Rabbanan made this takana, the takanas chachamim of daled kosos, as an independent entity, as a mitzvah nosefes, they declared that although Shomer Ka'oneh will operate with regard to the daled brachos, I don't know, Rabbi, I don't know what you do at your Seder. My father's minhag was that everybody recites all four brachos, but technically that's not required. It's a very nice custom, and you have to understand it. Maybe one day we'll understand it, but forget it. Just cross it off out. Doesn't exist. As far as what we're concerned about, every member of the Shomer Ka'oneh group who hears the bracha of the Baal Bayis, or whoever makes the bracha, fulfills his chiyuv of Kiddush, of Gal Yisrael, Birkas Hamazon, Hallel, simply by listening Shomei Ka'on. So once again, the question jumps back at us. You have Shomei Ka'on, one person is reciting the 4 brachas. Where's Daled Kosos? Where's the additional kiyum and dimension of a mitzvah Daled Kosos that is added by Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Gadol Bimcha, that makes the Daled Kosos of Leil HaSeder different? So the answer is Shtia. As far as Shtia is concerned, we're going to make a dent, a difference between Daled Kosos Shel Bracha, which is the universal halacha in which each kos, one shtia of any member of the group, is related to every other member of the group, as if he too drank from the kos, chad gufa. That halacha is suspended with regard to the Daled Kosos of Leil HaSeder as a separate additional kiyum, without chad gufa. So we're going to go back to the halacha that applies to a kos shel bracha, suspending the chad gufa, and whatever the requirements of a kos shel bracha are concerned, as far as shtia, we're going to require that each member of the group personally will implement that shtia. How much of a shtia do you need? The exact amount of shtia that's required in a kos shel bracha, which is malei lugmav, which is te'ima. But now each member of the household is going to have to personally involve himself in that action of shtias malei lugmav in order to add a dimension of a new kiyum, of a new mitzvah that was established called Daled Kosos. Even though the shomea is considered chad gufa with the mavarech, as far as the bracha is concerned, and as I said before, there's no need for anyone at the table to make his own bracha. Shomea code is sufficient, it's chad gufa. But le'inyan shtia, we will suspend the halacha of chad gufa and require that shtia of a kos shel bracha, of kiddush, etc., will be implemented by every member of the household. That's what upgrades this kos shel bracha and allows it to be integrated into a new mitzvah nosefes that the Rabbanim Misakim called Daled Kosos. That same shtia that is implemented by the mavarech through the halacha of kos shel bracha will now be implemented by every single one of the members of the household, as if his kos shel bracha requires shtia. He's alone. He's not chad gufa. He's Robinson Crusoe as far as shtia of the kos shel bracha. But again, it's always kos shel bracha. It remains kos shel bracha. And the requirement is going to be malei lugmav of te'ima, just that each person stands alone as far as that extra kiyum of shtia of a kos shel bracha, which is now going to be a te'ima of malei lugmav implemented by every member of everyone sitting at the table. The imkain asi shapir divrei Tosos varosh sheishru legamri as din shtias hayayin shel Daled Kosos the din shtias yayin v'kiddush. Again, it's the same identical requirement of shtia of Daled Kosos of kos shel bracha, of kiddush, that applies now to Daled Kosos, with the one exception that I can't fulfill my shtia of a kos shel bracha through your shtia. L'din shtias yayin de kiddush v'shar dvar metunim kos. V'chein amru shekemoshe bekiddush sagi b'malei lugmav hu edi b'dalet kosos sagi b'malei lugmav. Now we understand very well why is it that this school of thought, headed up by Kosos and the Rosh, are happy and suffice with Moli Lugmav in the case of Dalit Kosos, because it's the same Moli Lugmav as a kosher bracha. Just that I have to drink it, you have to drink it, he has to drink it, each one has to drink it. And with regard to Chai, if a kosher bracha is recited on Yayin Chai, then Dalit Kosos is on Yayin Chai. Because the whole nafkamina now, to upgrade and add the extra kiyum of Dalit Kosos, is the personal, individual shtia of whatever shtia is required in a kosher bracha, which means Molei Lugmav, which means Chai. Hence, Tosas' equation to the Gemara Brachos Nun Beis with regard to Birkas Hamazon on Yain Chai, and Tosas jumps to the conclusion that the same halacha should apply in Dalit Kosav Leila Seder. It's correct, because the Dalit Kosav Leila Seder are generated by the kosher bracha, which is on a Yain Chai. On the other hand, in Dalit Kosos Be'inan Yain Mazug, the Gemara Daf on Kuf Ches seems to indicate that we need Yain Mazug on Dalit Kosos, then it would be Birkas HaMazon. Tos has a stira here, because the Gemara says in Birkas HaMazon that you make the bracha over Yain Chai. But if you're telling me that Dalit Kosos are recited over Yain Mazug, then the same din should apply and require the Mazug in Birkas Hamazon and Kos Shel Bracha. There's an absolute equation between Kosos Shel Bracha and Dalit Kosos, with the one exception that in order to upgrade it and add an additional dimension, additional kiyum, they were mafkia, they brought down the halacha of Chad Gufel in Shtir. That's the nafkamina. That's the only difference. Each person has to do the shtia, but it's again, after all is said and done, it's the shtia of Kosos Shel Bracha. So again, just to see the radical departure of the Amudei Hod from the Brisker Rav. You know, the Brisker Rav lived 50 years ago, let's say. I'm just rounding it off, right? And the truth is, I'm going to speak on a very personal level. I've taught this Brisker Rav many times. Not only for men, also for women. I taught it, I remember, in Mechala once. This is a fundamental Brisker Rav, and he understands that according to Tosfos, Dalit Kosos, it's just Kos Shel Bracha, period. So why does Tosfos say that we're going to require a kos for each one of the people? The answer is that yes, we agree with the Brisker Rav to some extent. But we're going to disagree with the Brisker Rav fundamentally, on the other hand. On the one hand, we're going to say the following. Yes, we're going to borrow halachos from Kos Shel Bracha. We're going to accept the principle of the Brisker Rav that according to Shitas HaTosfos, every kos of the four kosos is a separate entity called the Kos Shel Bracha. But we're going to disagree with the Brisker Rav on a very, very fundamental point, and we're going to insist, based on the Tshuvas HaRosh, that according to the sheet of the Rosh and Tosfos, the halach of Chad Gufa is suspended because the Rabbanan added another Kiyum mitzvah that obligates us in Dalit Kosos in a unique way that's different than four separate Kosos Shel Bracha, and that is this new entity of a Kiyum of Dalit Kosos that's going to require shtia on the part of every single individual. But that shtia, and here we go back to the Brisker Rav, in the sheet that Tos of the Rosh, that shtia is the shtia of a Kos Shel Bracha. So the Kiyum of Dalit Kosos is through a shtia of Kosos Shel Beracha with the laws and the restrictions and rules that govern a Kosos Shel Beracha. However, here's the point of departure from the Bris Rav. We have a separate, and let's call it a mitzvah nosefes, an additional mitzvah of Daled Kosos. So you'll ask me, what do you mean? How can you attach a mitzvah Daled Kosos on a pre-existing mitzvah of 4 Kosos of Beracha? And the answer is, when we undermine and cancel the principle of Chad Gufa, we're going to require that each individual member of the group will have his own Mole Lugmav, as if he were all alone, with no one else drinking, even though there are other people, there may be 10 other people at the Seder that are drinking Mole Lugmav, but each person has to drink his own Mole Lugmav. And that sets up the heker and the distinction here between Daled Kosos of Leil Seder as a kiyum of Sipi Yitzis Mitzrayim and Daled Kosos, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 separate Kosos Shel Beracha. Each one has to do the shtia. But what kind of shtia? It's the regular regimented shtia of Kosos Shel Beracha, which means it's only Mole Lugmav. We're going to reject the Ramban about Rov Kos. And it's going to be the Chai, or if you insist that it be Mazud, then every Kosos Shel Beracha will require Mazud. The only question that bothers us here is the logic. You know, there should be something compelling. I understand very well that the Rosh has an agenda and feels almost compelled to set up a mitzvah Daled Kosos as an additional separate kiyum. But how does he know what compels the Rosh to assume that extra additional kiyum of Daled Kosos should be, I don't know what English word for this, should be malbish it. You should, you translate that word into English and it's meaningless in this context. You know, it's dressed in the dress of Kosos Shel Beracha. In other words, once the Rosh in this new interpretation has gone as far as to postulate an additional kiyum of Daled Kosos, which requires that everyone drink, why drink the old familiar Mole Lugmav of the Kosos Shel Beracha? What compels the Rosh to that position? Yeah, I understand according to Brisker Rav, if you're limited and restricted to Kosos Shel Beracha, you're just doing 4 separate Kosos Shel Beracha, is Mole Lugmav. That's the key, that's the magical word. And the Brisker Rav will insist that one person's shtia of Mole Lugmav, whoever it'll be, will suffice for everyone else. And lo, we only have to supply the Ani himself with Daled Kosos. That makes sense. But if the Rosh jumps ship and adds an additional mitzvah on the night of the Seder of Daled Kosos, and the Rosh therefore postulates that on the night of Seder we need shtia, why not go all the way? Why not accept the Ramban? That shtia means drink the kos. And a kos means rov kos. No. The Rosh is happy with Mole Lugmav. Why? Because that's the halach that governs a classic Kosos Shel Beracha. But why? You're already parting ways with the presentation of the Brisker Rav that we're totally 100% limited to Kosos Shel Beracha. You're not happy with that. I understand. You want to give a certain special value, special stature to Daled Kosos on the Leil of the Seder and add another kiyum. You know, according to the presentation here of the Rosh, the way we're understanding it now, Kaviyachol, there would be 2 brachos on the Daled Kosos. Asher Kitshana Mitzosim Tzimanu al Kosos Shel Beracha. Asher Kitshana Mitzosim Tzimanu al Daled Kosos. 2 kiyumim that overlap. Now, for us, how do you differentiate? how do you add another kiyum? Well, the shtia has to be every individual. Once you're going that far, why not take it one step further? In Yiddish, we say loinzach zu sagen. It like attracts us, it allures us to say beyond this that you're requiring shtia on the part of every member of the group individually. You're being mavatal and mafkia, the principle of chad guf, and then why not require rov kos like the Ramban? Fall into the hands of the Ramban over here. Why should you be restricted by koshel bracha when you have a whole new kiyum of Dalit Kosos? I mean, in a word, I think this is what Ruben was saying last week, or maybe it was Steve. Cherus. I mean, you want to show cherus. You're talking about Moli Lugma. I mean, you're not demonstrating cherus with Moli Lugma. That's an old ancient halacha of koshel bracha, which applies to Abdullah. Let's say, for example, I don't know that there's cherus in Abdullah, although some people are dying to light up a cigarette. So maybe that's called cherus, in Abdullah. I don't know. But really, the Kosos shel Beracha have nothing to do with cherus. And you're motivated to add a new category and a new mitzvah, the dimension of Dalit Kosos as part and parcel of Sipitis Mitzrayim, then why govern yourselves by the laws that apply to an old mitzvah of Kosos shel Beracha, namely Moli Lugma? Let's be very original over here. Let's come up with a brand new category that we've never encountered before in the context of the old, ancient, classic mitzvah of Kosos shel Beracha, which can be fulfilled with Moli Lugma. Come up with something new. We like chidushim. You want a new dimension and a new kiyum? Then make it crystal clear by requiring rov kos. Okay. Now we get to the hard part. And that's plowing through the tshuva of the Rosh, word for word. And to be honest with you, from the school of my education in Torah, who wants to plow through a tshuva? Maybe Professor Twersky, Zichrono Livracha in Boston, who had a PhD program in Harvard. You want to get a PhD in Jewish history or Jewish philosophy, you plow through a tshuva, word for word. That was never my style. I was not a member of the Harvard Kollel, as they say in Boston. I never, I learned by Rav Soloveitchik for 5 years. He never, ever plowed through a tshuva. I never heard it. Maybe somebody else knows that he did. It was not the style. But Rav Soloveitchik would plow through the Rishonim, word for word. Especially Tosos or Rashi, Tosa Ramban, or Rambam, word for word. What we call Harvin. Harvin means, sweat it out. What we're learning now is a tshuva of the Rosh. Let's not diminish the significance of plowing through a tshuva of the Rosh. Even though it's a tshuva, and we're going to have to do some detective work and figure out what the Shoel was saying and what it was his logic, and then see why the Rosh disagrees with the Shoel. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, you're reading the holy words of a Rishon, of the Rosh. So with all due respect, I like the tshuvas of Rav Ovadia Yosef. Every shaila gets a tshuva 40 pages or more. You know what I mean? So Rav Soloveitchik would not plow through such a tshuva. But in the case of the Rosh, on Dalit Kosos, which touches on the very definition of Kosos shel Beracha in general, of Kiddush, Havdalah, etc., I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to plow through the tshuva of the Rosh. And this entire page, Hey, Os Gimel, is a word-for-word copy of the Tshuvas Rosh. I could actually go into Bar Ilan and send you this tshuva of the Rosh Klal Chafei Siman Aleph, and I wouldn't need this whole page here, page Hey. So we only have about 5 minutes left for this year, but what I'd like to do in these 5 minutes is just read through the text of the Rosh. I don't know if we'll finish it, but we'll give it a shot. Umasha Kasavta. So again, we don't have the letter that was written to the Rosh, but the Rosh is responding, Masha Kasavta, that which you wrote, Vahi the Arvei Psochim, Hamakadesh v'tar mole lugmav yotza v'imlav lo yotza. So the Shel, who raised the question, he looked at the Gemara and he saw that the Makadesh is required to drink a mole lugmav, and he said to himself, "This is the Shel. Maybe that's halach in Kiddush. Maybe in another koshel bracha, and the one that he was focused on in this tshuva is Havdalah. Maybe for Havdalah you don't need a mole lugmav. Says the Rosh, I don't know any logical reason to differentiate between Kiddush on the one hand and Havdalah on the other. Kiddush is a classic koshel bracha, and if the halacha requires moli lugmav, that's going to apply to every koshel bracha. Maishna Kiddush, Maishna Havdalah. Why do you say that Havdalah doesn't require moli lugmav? Elakol davar shetzarich kos. Any bracha that requires a kos, tzarich teimas moli lugmav. Who has to drink from the kos? O amavarich, o acher. Or to plug in the Ritva's principle, the way the Chazon Ish embellishes it, chad gufa. So what are you going to tell me? Maybe there's a chumrah in Kiddush above and beyond any koshel bracha. Like, for example, I've built. She'll tell me the following. So the Rosh is reading between the lines of the michtav, of the letter that was written to him. He says, you'll tell me, wait a minute. Havdalah is only d'Rabbanan. Kiddush is Doraisa. Zachar is Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsha. Maybe on a Doraisa, the halacha was more machmir to require mole lugmav, but Havdalah is only d'Rabbanan. Man, hello, Kiddush ala yayin eino min Torah. That's wrong. Kiddush is Doraisa, but only amiras dvarim. Zachar is Yom HaShabbos. You have to remember the Shabbat. But you don't have to remember it according to biblical law over a koshel yayin. The requirement of Kiddush ala yayin is only d'Rabbanan. And in fact, Kiddush d'Oraisa we fulfill way before Kiddush d'Rabbanan when we daven Ma'ariv in Shul. V'chein matzinu be'arba kosos hishka mehen lebanav u'grei beso yotza Amar Rav Nachbar Yitzchak v'hu d'shasi ruba d'kas. Which again, you remember that the Rosh identifies ruba d'kas with mole lugmav. Alma be'init sheyishta ruba kos d'hainu mole lugmav. You have to admit to me, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that Dalit Kosos is only d'Rabbanan, and yet Rav Nachman requires that they drink Rov Kos, which equals to mole lugmav. So you see, mole lugmav applies straight across the board to any koshel bracha. And this fits very well into what we discussed in great length before, that according to the Rosh, Dalit Kosos are governed by the same requirements as a koshel bracha, except that each one has to drink his own cup. So you see that a koshel bracha requires mole lugmav. V'yim tikshe lecha amaya yotzi b'meshem shosim. He says the following. Why does Rav Nachman say that one second, where's the language here? Why do you need that? I'm equating Dalid Kosos with Koshel Beracha. If that be the case, if Tikshulcha Mayeni Yotzim B'Mesha Haim Shosim, it could be anyone at the table who will drink from the Dalid Kosos. Each one is a Koshel Beracha. Afilo Yishtu Mi Ruben the Kosa the kind, right? So Ruven doesn't drink, Shimon drinks. Hamavarech Tzorch Sheyitom Hu Oacherim. From the perspective of a Koshel Beracha classic, any member of the group could drink from the kos. Kinamrim be'erevin, gavi kiddush b'yom ha'kippurim. Kiddush b'yom ha'kippurim, no one's going to drink from the kos because of the isa shtia. So we'll give it to a child. All right, at the end we don't do this. We're afraid that maybe somebody else will drink for. Whatever the reason is, we don't make kiddush on Yom Kippur. But in theory, conceptually, we make kiddush on Yom Kippur. One person will drink from the kos, and that's the Yanuka, the child. So why is it that with regard to Daled Kosos, Rav Nachman insists that Hishka mihen lebanav u'lebrei beisa? Yishlom deshani hacha shatinoko shosim b'shvil chiyuva shel atzmon, which either means they're bar mitzvah or midin chinuch, but every single one of them has a personal chiyuv. Shavheim chayov bar b'kosa. This is a little bit interesting, that a lot different than what we said until now. Until now, we said that each one has to drink, not because of his personal obligation, but because they were mafkia in Daled Kosos, the halacha of Chayv Gufa, because they wanted to upgrade it to a separate kiyum of Daled Kosos. Now he's saying something a little differently. He's saying that each one has his own chiyuv. Yeah, but that's true even for Kiddush, each one has his own chiyuv. Hilkoch ein shtiosan ol lahashlim shir aviyah. All right, we don't know what that means. That'll be for tomorrow. It's a Shemi Nami, Hodvidin Shishta, who Roba Kosa Mishub, the Viinon, Binyan Acher, Lo Yotza, Yede Chovas Nyain. Al Vishard Vamatunin Kos, Daiva, Seshakal Shosim, Yishtu, Rov Kos. I think when he says kol ha-shosim, he means not all shosim, but any shosim. Kol means kol echad v'echad, any one of the members of the festival. Is yishtu rov kos ha'inu moli lu. V'yein lomer and kain ein raya mikanote. This is already more. That we'll have to leave for tomorrow. So believe neder, what I'd like to cover tomorrow is the balance of this tshuva, the Rosh. I mean, again, the words of the Rosh, line by line, word by word. Now, tomorrow, we have our regular 9:30 shir, but we'll end a drop early, maybe at 10:30, and then we'll have a half-hour shir. I think we'll keep it on this tether, how do you say it in English, on this same link. Steve, does that make sense to you? So we'll continue this link. We'll close the Gemara and the Amudei Hod for Psachim, and we'll open up Sanhedrin. And at 11 a.m., after the introduction that we had for a half hour or 25 minutes, whatever we're able to accomplish, we'll jump in to another link, which we're going to send out. So pay attention. We sent it out last week. We'll send it out again this week. I don't know what we're going to do 2 weeks from now when Steve is in America. That's a different question, but you'll have that link, and we'll shut off this link that we're on now, this meeting number, etc. And at 11 a.m., we're going to talk again about the difference between a D'Rabbanan and a Doraisa, which in Masechta Sanhedrin, in the parak that we're learning, Ben Soar Mor is very critical. Okay, then, so just pay attention.
One other thing, Rabbi.
Yeah.
We're going to start meeting on Wednesdays as well now.
Thank you for reminding me. I finished my term of duty in a place called Dache Yonason on Wednesdays. So Wednesday, we go back to a regular day. So the only difference in our schedule is that number one, on Mondays at 11, we switch over to another link. And on Thursdays, I give the Daf Yomi at 10:45. Did I get that right? I think so. No?
No,
When
you
do
give
I
it at,
Daf Yomi on Thursdays?
you give it at 9:45.
9:45, sorry, 9:45.
So we
on
just have the,
Thursdays, you could join me for the Daf Yomi if you like, right? And that Daf Yomi shir will replace this 9:35 shir, and then after the Daf Yomi, we have a 10:45 shir, which sometimes a little bit late, and that's the shir of Masechta Sanhedrin. So those are the two minor, I call it minor changes that result from my reestablishing myself in Ephraim. Okay then? Wish everyone a good day, and now we'll learn a little Masechta Sanhedrin on the other link.